Hi, I'm John Ridley, and this is Critical Content, a celebration of some of the year's most outstanding documentary filmmaking. Critical Content is produced by No Studios and sponsored by the American Family Institute for Corporate and Social Impact. With documentaries such as City of Ghosts and Cartel Land, director Matthew Heineman has consistently delivered films that have combined what one journalist has described as gonzo fearlessness with empathetic sensitivity. Heineman takes this style to new heights in his film Retrograde, which looks at the last days of the nearly 2 decades-long war in Afghanistan. The film premiered this year at the Telluride Film Festival, and it's a pleasure to welcome to Critical Content director Matthew Heineman. Matthew, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I read an interview of yours where you began with talking about the inception of this film, and you said something that I took as being incredibly humble when you said that you didn't want to start with the cliched idea of what it means to fight a war, and yet I think you've probably captured it in one of the most amazing ways that anybody can because it's so personal. Just talk about the inception of this idea, because it wasn't easy getting to Afghanistan. If I understand correctly, it was almost a 5-year process for you to get approval to go to Afghanistan. So over that time, not even knowing what you were going to be able to capture when you get there, how did the inception of this idea involve over that 5-year period?
Yeah, I mean, this began with this sort of, as you said, this what I thought was a cliched question of why we fight wars. I began exploring that with the Army Ranger community. That turned out to be a dead end. I connected with my producing partner, Caitlin McNally, and started that process with the Green Berets. And it took several years to gain their trust, to infiltrate that community, to make them feel comfortable with what we intended to do, and to get the permissions necessary to go on this embed. And COVID happened, and I ended up making another film in between about COVID called The First Wave. So by the time we actually deployed, it wasn't until January 2021. And that was sort of the initial shift, was that, wow, actually through this deployment, we could actually see the end of this war, the longest war in U.S. history. And it turned out to be the last U.S. deployment to Afghanistan.
So when you finally got to go to Afghanistan, the film, the central individual in this film is an Afghani by the name of General Sami Sadat. When did you land on him as the entree into the storytelling?
So again, yeah, I mean, it began as this sort of a portrait of the Green Berets, and then obviously, 3 months into filming, our president pulled out our troops, and so we were left with this question of, what is this film? We had the first act of a film, we had the beginning of a film, but by no means did we have a full film. And so in looking at the footage, General Sadat really emerged as this really intriguing character. He had been working side by side with the Green Berets. Part of the Green Berets mission is working with partner forces, in this case obviously the Afghan army. And so, General Sadat just was supremely interesting and compelling on camera. And so I reached back out to him and asked him, would you be open to us shifting the lens to focus on you and your men in this next chapter? At that point, it wasn't a fait accompli that the Afghan army was going to lose to the Taliban. And so, I explained my style of filmmaking, how immersive it was, how we'd likely be filming, 16, 18, 20 hours a day. And would he be open to that? And he thought about it for a few days and said yes. And we went back to Afghanistan and started filming.
Yeah, I want to talk about your filmmaking style because it's so, in some ways, counterpoint to the chaos that's going on. But I want to talk about General Sadat for just a moment, because he is an incredibly unique individual. As I mentioned to you before we started the interview, I come from a family of service. I've been around the military, and I have one perception of it. He's such a gentle person who's in command of such a almost impossible task, but it's incredibly personal for him. And he talks about that in the film, and he talks about his father. Just, if you can for a second, give a little context to General Sadat and talk about his father and why this fight for him is not just an existential battle, it's a very personal struggle.
Yeah, I mean, his father was a soldier as well, and he fought against the Taliban. He was imprisoned by the Taliban, and so it is and was a very personal fight for him. Obviously, there's been a cyclical nature of warfare and fighting in Afghanistan for many decades preceding the U.S. But I think he obviously inherited this desire to fight for his country and defend his country. And, in many ways, he was the next generation, trained by the West, funded by the West, and, was in many ways fighting for a progressive democratic society where women could go to school, they could go outside without their faces covered. These are all values that he believed in and that he was trying to defend in this, final fight against the Taliban.
Yeah, it's one of those things when you talk about exiting the war, and we may have feelings about it in this country, but when you see someone who has to make these decisions and make these choices, it's very difficult to put yourself in their position because they don't get to leave. One of the things that I appreciate about this film, it is so much about choices that are made, about the choice that President Biden made, about the choice that people like General Sadat have to make. Do I fight? Do I flee? But there's also a space where the U.S. soldiers don't necessarily have a choice. And what I love is you capture that. There's actually a quote that one of the soldiers has where he says something to the effect of, if you have all the information you need to make a decision, the time to make the decision has probably already left and gone. You can't make that decision anymore. And I really appreciated, as you say, taking the politics out of the film and let the individuals express themselves. That gets into your style of storytelling. And as I mentioned earlier, this was an opportunity. There's war, there's fighting. It could be just about the battle, the conflict. It's so incredibly intimate. It's so much about these individuals. That is one of the hallmarks of your filmmaking. Talk about that in general, what you like to bring to storytelling, and talk about it specifically in Retrograde, how you applied it to this story when there's action and there's shooting, but it's really about individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I think, throughout my career, if there's one through line, it's trying to take these large amorphous subjects, drug war in Mexico, ISIS in Syria, COVID, and trying to humanize it, trying to personalize it, trying to put a human face to it. These are issues that are so often relegated to stats and to headlines, thrown around like political football in Washington. And, my job, my goal, my entire sort of essence and being is trying to make it feel like these things are more relatable, more closer to you, to create an empathetic connection between audiences. And again, these things that feel so distant or so far away, but really aren't. And so, my style of filmmaking is character driven. It's verite, it's observational. There's no context. There's no talking heads. There's no interviews, although I do interviews all the time, but you don't see them. I want to take you on a journey. I want to make you feel like you are there. I want to make you feel, in this case with Retrograde, that you're in the rooms as President Biden decides to pull out, the U.S. from Afghanistan. I want to feel like you're in the room as, General Sadat is making these impossible decisions of trying to defend Lashkar, this final stronghold against the Taliban. I want to make you feel like what it's like to be like in a helicopter that's being shot at by the Taliban, and the fear that comes with that. And hopefully in doing so, again, making these issues feel a little bit more relatable.
Yeah, there are also moments in your film where you let things play, and they play in a manner that, at least for me as the audience, you get a sense of, in sometimes, I don't want to call them overly little things, but if you can't get this right, how do you get a wider war right? So there's a moment where General Sadat has just had some injured soldiers. The U.S. is trying to help him get them evac'd and to some medical help. And they're basically, they being the Americans, are set up for 4 individuals. The general has 6 individuals. And to sit and hear the horse trading, for lack of a better word, that needs to go on is really remarkable. And even though everyone is trying to work towards a great outcome, that you have to go through something like that just to help individuals. There's another small moment in the film that I just felt so powerful when, as Americans are exiting a base and the Afghanis are taking over and they're trying to raise their flag, and basically the flag gets tangled up in its own cord. They can't even get the flag, this just basic honorific event, and they can't get it correct. I would love for you to talk about your partners in this, the other cinematographers. You do your own shooting, and you also had 2 cinematographers, forgive me if I mangled their names slightly, Timothy Gruscha and Olivier Sarbel. These are 2 individuals who also basically go wherever the story needs to go. They're hardened. I think you talked about one individual who's carrying literal wounds from being near a blast. Talk about your partnership with these 2 other, and when I say blast, by the way, I mean this very sincerely, a bomb blast, not because you guys were out just in a dangerous area. Talk about your relationship with your cinematographers, and talk about your approach. Particularly, there's so much you capture just with people's eyes. And what I love and what I miss sometimes in narrative filmmaking, it's not about what somebody else is saying. It's not about being on the quote-unquote star of the film. It's about absorbing what is going on through the eyes of individuals who are there. Just please, if you can, talk about the relationship with the other cinematographers.
So, yeah, I mean, historically, I've shot on every film that I've made, and the look and feel of my films is really, really, really important to me. I obviously, a lot of documentaries are trying to feel like narrative films. A lot of narrative films are trying to feel like documentaries. I love playing in this space between the two. I've made a narrative film myself. So, I think the look and feel of my docs is really, really, really important to me. And so, we spoke extensively for months about, because I hadn't worked with Olivier or Tim, about how I wanted to shoot this, my style of shooting. I think one of the interesting things is when you're shooting in a foreign language, like we don't speak Dari or Pashto, you're forced to, sort of shoot based on reactions as opposed to dialogue. When you're shooting in English, you often are trying to, get that line on camera. Obviously, when you don't understand every, period and comma of every sentence, you're forced to shoot more based on reaction shots. And so I love shooting that way because it really creates this emotional connection with the subjects that you're filming. And in this case, developed this motif really of holding on faces for a really, really, really long time. Faces don't lie, people lie. And, you can learn so much about a situation or a person by just holding on their faces and seeing their eyes. And that motif, also obviously continued in the edit room and was solidified in the edit room as we, pieced the film together. But, it started really when Biden pulled out our troops. And we, the Green Berets are not allowed legally to say what they feel about their commander-in-chief or the decisions that he's making. But their faces speak 1,000 words. That moment leading all the way up until the end, holding for 36 seconds and 14 frames on a young woman at the fence, desperately pleading to get into the airport in the final days of this war. She writes a novella for us. In those 36 seconds, we literally run through the entire emotional spectrum of the human experience: fear, trepidation, anger, pleading, and it's all there without words. And so, yes, like the faces really became an important part of telling this story.
Yeah, there's no doubt in this film, though, that war is constantly around you. There are moments where even General Sadat, who's a hardened soldier, is saying, "Hey, we gotta step back. We're getting sniper fire." You're in helicopters where you're taking fire. You're in convoys where you know that the other side, the Taliban, know that you're with. They don't, not necessarily about you, but that they're targeting General Sadat. You've said that you're not an action junkie. That even though you're in places where there's a lot going on, you don't mind being in harm's way, but you're not an action junkie. What does drive you to put yourself in a situation where you're willing to capture the story irrespective of what's around you? And even as you are filming the withdrawal of American soldiers and troops and other people are leaving, you're at that fence, as you say, capturing the look of an individual in their face. Do you put guardrails on yourself and your crew, or do you all decide, hey, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this irrespective of what happens because this is a story that needs to be told?
I mean, I think there's no question that obviously that's what drives us is this deep pull to tell these stories that we believe are important to be told. I think when you're in a war zone, when you're in a conflict zone, anyone who's been there knows that everyone sort of has a red line. You try not to cross that red line. You often walk up to it, you kiss it, but you try not to cross it. That being said, the main danger really is becoming complacent. The longer you're exposed to danger, the easier it is to become complacent with that danger and to start making bad decisions. So you also have to be incredibly cognizant of that. All that being said, there obviously, as we just discussed, there's a scene when I night after night I was taking these. I was going on these resupply missions. The town of Goresh, which was nearby the base that we were filming in, incredibly strategically important town. If that town fell, it was one step closer to Helmand province falling, the province that General Sadat was in charge of. And so night after night, I was going on these missions to try to resupply this town until finally, on this final night, they kept failing. They kept, for various reasons, not being able to complete the mission. And so it was very clear on this final night that there was a high likelihood that, there would be some sort of ambush. And that is, in fact, what happened. As we descended to resupply these besieged Afghan army troops, the Taliban started shooting RPGs at us. And, I was in that helicopter shooting myself. And, there's absolutely nothing I can do. I have zero agency. I don't know how to fly a helicopter. I don't know how to shoot a gun. The only thing that I can control is my camera. And so that's what I choose to focus on in those moments. Aperture, framing, making sure the record button's on, mixing the sound, make sure the sound's not peaking. Those are things that I choose to focus on. Because if I'm going to risk my life and be in those situations, I want to make sure it at least sounds and looks good. And so, that's really important to me. And so, yeah, I think obviously some people, say I'm an adrenaline junkie or that I enjoy being in those situations. That it really couldn't be farther from the truth. These films have had a profound impact on me. I have nightmares almost every single night. I suffer from PTSD. And I don't say that because I want pity. I say that because I think it's important to destigmatize these issues around mental health. And, also what comes with it is guilt, the guilt of having a blue passport and be able to come home and sit here in the privilege of sitting here on a Zoom with you and talking from my office in New York, and be able to lead these situations. So, there's a lot that goes into telling these stories beyond obviously what you just, what you see on screen.
Yeah, I think people would be hard pressed to look at your work while they talk about gonzo filmmaking, to associate it with gonzo filmmaking because it is so patient. It is so connected to individuals. And you put their emotions and what they're going through first. And I love that it does eschew trying to get a commentary. How do the soldiers, even if you could get them to talk about, is this right or is this wrong? Because, and I believe you mentioned this in another interview, it's filming people making Sophie's choices. And no matter what they do, it's not going to be a good choice. Politics has very little to do with it. What if we'd stayed? That would have not satisfied people. If General Sadat had been killed, what would that have meant? And I do appreciate from your human nature, you put yourself in very difficult situations, but you talked about in an interview the one time that you felt that maybe you failed as a filmmaker. You still didn't have agency. You were coming from Dubai, trying to get to Afghanistan. It was a very critical moment. Talk about what happened and talk about why you felt, even though no fault of your own, that it was a moment of failure in a film that is otherwise, and by the way, I certainly am not going to say it is failure. If I understand the interview correctly, it's what you felt. This film succeeds on so many levels about being human. There's something that we couldn't witness, but it was a very human moment for you as well.
Yeah, so in mid-August, we're planning on going back to this film with General Sadat, what we thought would be the final sort of battle with the Taliban. And, we mobilized, we started, we got to Dubai. When we got to Dubai, things started to fall quite rapidly. And we took off on a flight for Kabul. And as we descended into the valley of Kabul, the pilot got on the intercom and said, "We can't land, there's a plane on the tarmac." We were so low that, all of our phones started ping, 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 ping. And we got these news alerts that the Taliban had taken over the city, in essence, the country, and that plane on the tarmac was actually President Ghani fleeing the country. And so our pilot was too scared to land. We go back to Dubai, and I'm sitting there in the, airport hotel in Dubai watching this story play out on TV. And I just, as you said, I just felt like it was the greatest journalistic, filmmaking, whoever I am, failure of my career. I'd spent 8 months building this story. My main subject was at the center of all this, and I'm sitting there watching it from hundreds of miles away. And, basically spent every waking minute after that trying to figure out how to get back into the country, which we did 5 days later. But by that time, General Sadat had been forced to flee. And so when we land, at that point, it was just Tim and I. When we land at the airport, I have no utility as a journalist. I'm not there for as a reporting for the BBC or CNN or Fox. I'm there as a filmmaker telling the story, but my main subject that I've been following for months was gone. And so, with every failure comes an opportunity. With every door that closes, the door opens. And what this allowed us to do is open up the aperture of the storytelling to see the civilians that General Sadat had been fighting for, to see the civilians that the Green Berets had been fighting for, that up until that point we hadn't seen yet. And so, I made this decision to leave the airport, to go outside the wire, and to try to, again, humanize the experience of these thousands and thousands of civilians desperately trying to flee Taliban rule. And, if I'd landed on that plane, I would have likely stayed with General Sadat and had a much more sort of narrow view on this final chapter. And, because of that miss, it really opened up the storytelling. And I don't think the film would be the same if that hadn't happened.
Yeah, it's certainly incredibly powerful. And you don't quite book in, but you start outside the airport where soldiers are keeping regular civilians away. You come back to that moment, and it's harrowing. You talked about in an interview seeing young soldiers, 18, 19 years old, who are trained to fight the enemy, but in a position where they're trying to keep people who are holding up documents, anything they can, trying to beg and barter their way beyond these soldiers to relative safety of trying to get on an airplane and get out of the country. You had said in an interview that this may have been one of the first times as a filmmaker where you were overcome with emotion for certain moments while you were making this film. Talk about how difficult it was to film at a space where people are doing everything they can to get on the plane. And then I believe it was the same spot where just a few days later, ISIS carried out a horrible suicide bombing that killed both Afghanis and some American soldiers. Just talk about, for you, emotionally, how difficult. You talk about not having agency, but you're still there as a human being, and it comes through in every frame how human this film is. But if you can, talk about how difficult and challenging it is for you as a person to only be able to witness.
So I guess I'll talk about probably two scenes. There's one scene that happened at what was called the North Gate of the airport. There was thousands of civilians jammed up against this large cement fence, and they weren't opening that fence. And so, when we got there, it was like everyone just packed really tightly against this wall. And I thought it was really important to go up and see what it felt like to be in amongst that group of people. And so I sort of weaved my way through the crowd and got myself to the front of the wall. And honestly, it was probably the scariest moment of the shoot. Because there's a very, very high likelihood of a stampede. The crowd was sort of swaying and moving, and there's all sorts of, there's tons of kids around. And I just I was nervous, obviously, for myself, but I was obviously really, really nervous for, that these kids were going to get trampled. And so, it was really hot. It was sweaty. Most people there hadn't eaten or drinking for days. And so, often I sort of hide behind the camera, and, I feel like it's my job to try to transmit this story through my lens, and that's my responsibility. But in this case, every couple minutes, basically, I would put my camera down and I would just plead with the everyone around me to just like relax. They're not going to open that door. We have to sit down, otherwise someone's going to get killed. And so I just was constantly sort of shifting back and forth between this human being trying to settle the crowd down and trying to capture it and shoot this moment, while also trying to get like water from the Marines up on the fence to, because so many people hadn't had anything to drink for days. And so it was really just emotionally deep and complex, and obviously processing a lot. And then, a couple of days later at the Abbey Gate, it was a scene unlike anything that I'd ever experienced in my career. I filmed a lot of sad things in my life. Certainly cried at various stages of the filmmaking process, but I'd never cried while filming. And seeing thousands and thousands and thousands of Afghan civilians packed like sardines in this 4-foot sewage ditch, as 18-year-old Marines who weren't even alive when the Twin Towers fell were making these impossible decisions on who to let in and who not to let in. As the Taliban was watching us from 100 yards away, as ISIS was circling around us with suicide vests waiting to attack, which happened 12 hours later in the very spot that we were filming, I just had tears streaming down my face, and I kept having to wipe the lens down, and all I could think about was, what have we done, and how did we get here? It just was really deeply troubling.
Yeah, there's a remarkable moment in the film where one American soldier asks another soldier how old he is, and he says, I think, 18, 19. And he's like, wow, you weren't even alive when this happened. And you realize, this is a war an entire generation has grown up in, and yet there was no way necessarily out of this conflict. You feel the emotions every step of the way. You humanize it every step of the way. And there's a moment at the end of the film, in what has already been a remarkable journey of storytelling, where you are with the Taliban and they are having a large meeting. I was stunned to see it in the film. When I initially saw it, I thought, well, maybe this was somehow pool footage from other photographers. You shot this. Out of everything you went to, you have to please describe how you were able to get into one of the most remarkable meetings, and in some ways, I don't want to say you intentionally did this, but balance this film with what we're fighting against, and had the opportunity. Again, I don't want to say that you humanized the Taliban. I don't know if that's possible, but at least presented them as people. Talk about how you ended up with that moment in the film.
So when we left the airport, so when we arrived at the airport, I made this decision to leave the wire, to leave the airport, not knowing whether we'd be able to get back in, not knowing whether we'd be able to get on a flight. And, you know, one of the first things I heard about was this Taliban meeting at the Polytechnic Institute in Kabul. And, you know, a few colleagues had told us about this. And honestly, it's not that sexiest story. Like we drove up, we asked them if we could film, and we walked in. They said yes, and we walked in and we shot. And obviously it was incredibly surreal being in that room, having spent so much of my conscientious adult life reading about the Taliban, hearing about the Taliban, the previous several months being shot at by the Taliban, to be in this room with all of their senior leadership was quite surreal. And you know, started out very timidly, sort of shooting these masters and these wides from the back, and then, you know, got closer and closer. And I was like, you know, if I'm shooting from the side of the stage, I might as well get on the stage. If I'm on the stage, I might as well get an over. If I'm getting an over, I might as well get it tight. You know, it just started to get a bit perhaps cocky, but more confident, knowing that they weren't stopping me from doing this. And yeah, you know, as you said, I think it was important, as a really important part of the film. I mean, by the end of the film, we've been with most of the key players of this conflict: the civilians, the U.S. military, the Afghan military, and the Taliban. Obviously, not in equal measure, but hopefully by the end of this journey, at least, you've met all the key players. And I think, you know, it's so easy for these issues to be relegated to political talking points. And I really, really try hard in my films, to keep politics out of it. I think our world is divided enough. We live in these echo chambers and these silos. And, you know, I really hope that my films in general allow people from all different political parties and persuasions and backgrounds and races and belief sets to have an entry point to discuss and debate. You know, that to me, that's the only way rational dialogue or rational progress can happen is if we all get in the room and you know, argue and think about and you know, pontificate on these issues. And, you know, if there's one thing that I hope this film does, it's you know, we seem to have forgotten about this conflict. You know, the war in Ukraine has taken up so much oxygen in international news media, rightly so. It's one of the most important stories of our lifetime. But we've forgotten about the people of Afghanistan in the longest war in U.S. history. And I really hope that Retrograde, at the very least, you know, allows people to sort of remember what happened and think about what happened and perhaps learn what happened. The title Retrograde is a military term for leaving a war zone, but, you know, obviously it also means moving backwards. You know, in many ways we're back where we were 20 years ago. Girls can't go to school, women can't go outside without their faces covered. And so, you know, I just hope that, that the film creates a dialogue around this country that we left behind.
Matthew, I cannot think of a better way to have contextualized what this 20-year war has been about. As you say, what our objectives may have been going in, and what we've left behind as we've had to make this choice, or the choice has been made politically here to move away from it. But your film does an amazing job of leaving the politics out and opening a space for humanity and allowing the audience to have to ask difficult questions and do it in a way that's based on real lives. The film is Retrograde. It is absolutely remarkable. Matthew, thank you, not just for this film, but for your ability to go where the story takes you and the desire to bring those stories back home for all of us. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure chatting with you. I really appreciate it.
It's been Critical Content. We appreciate you joining. Thank you very much.